can open your Bibles to Acts chapter 27 this morning. And, I was just thinking about this. I was thinking about, Christmas and everything. And, this is the last Sunday before Christmas. And I'm pondering just the reality of the incarnation of God becoming a man, And I don't know about you, but if I was God, I could tell him some things, about how to do it right, because if the Son of God was going to be, if my son, it was the Son of God, and he was going to be born in this world, then it would probably be done in some holy high temple of the firstborn Son of God, on the top of a mountain with a big, light shining on it and glory coming from it and angels singing around it all the time. And it would be, it'd be like the most announced, most amazing thing ever. And yet, it just blows my mind, because that just would make sense, right? The Son of God coming into the world, it's going to be... but what does he do instead? Instead, he has him coming into the world in the most humble, the most base circumstances. You just think about like a baby being born in an alley somewhere, think about a baby being born in a barn, in a feeding area for animals. And coming into this world, being laid in a manger, not on a throne and not in a golden bassinet, but in a manger, a feeding trough for animals. And yet, just to live that life lowly, despised, being a servant, even dying the death of the cross, which was the most humiliating way to die. And yet it just shows not only the humility of God, but just the great sacrifice that he would make for us. I've seen temples in all kinds of different religions, and I've seen magnificent structures and beauty and all of that. And yet, the simplicity of Jesus is so much more beautiful, isn't it? Just how beautiful he is in his simplicity and in his care and in his love for us, that he would bear our sins. And just think about that. God of the universe bearing your sins is such a beautiful thing. And in Jesus coming into this world, giving us the greatest gift that anybody could possibly ever give us, and yet, how damaged was that gift in shipping? How bruised, how beaten was he for us, and yet the most beautiful thing we've ever received. And so, I do have a priority this morning to say that to you, because it is almost Christmas, but I also have another priority, and that is to get through the book of Acts before the end of the year. And so, while I could do an amazing Christmas message this morning, probably not, but I could try to give a Christmas message this morning. I'm not going to so much. We are going to be in Acts chapter 27 this morning, and we'll do our Christmas message on Christmas Eve. So join us in Husky Park on the 24th at 6:30 p.m. It should be a fun time. You can stay warm by your candle that you're going to have. We even have glow sticks for the kids, so it's going to be a fun time for everybody. Hot chocolate. Ladies making cookies. It's going to be a good time. So come down for that and bring some friends. But, I just have to ask you the question this morning. It is that time of year. So does everybody have their Christmas shopping done? No, men say no. Women say yes. Okay, that's good. That makes sense. I heard on the radio the other day that actually Black Friday was kind of a dud this year. Did you guys hear that? The shopping, like the turnout that they were expecting, was way lower than previous years. Is actually kind of a record low, but online shopping, it wasn't that people weren't shopping, online shopping was in the billions more, and Cyber Monday was actually like a huge success, and that's kind of crazy, and I understand that a bit. I like to shop online, and there's two reasons for that. One is I just don't like to go into stores, right? So I like to go into stores and wander through and look at stuff. I can click online, sit in my chair, hit buy, and then it's over, right? That's one reason. But the other reason is maybe something you wouldn't expect, and that is I love the UPS truck. Ever since I was a kid, and I think it was because my grandparents were sending us gifts one year, and I remember sitting on my couch. I just vividly remember this, sitting on my couch looking out the window as the UPS truck drove up. And they got out and they brought a package in, and we opened that package and it was presents for me. And so ever since then, I just have this warm, fuzzy feeling about the UPS truck. Whenever I see it go by and it drives past my place, I feel a little bit sad. But whenever it pulls in, it's like brings warm feelings to my heart. I'm so excited. And the added benefit to that is now that I'm getting older, I don't always remember what I bought. And so he comes and they bring it up to the house, and I'm excited to open it because I'm like, oh, what is it? I can't remember. Did I buy anything? And I open it up, I'm like, oh yeah, sweet. So it's like this added bonus. But I just love the UPS man. I could hug him. He's like Santa Claus to me. But nothing is worse than when we paid for something, and you actually remember you bought it, and it's delayed in coming, and then when it finally arrives, the smile turns into a frown. This is Shannon's Christmas present. It was supposed to be one piece. Just kidding. No, it's actually Isaiah's Christmas present. Isaiah. Anyway, he didn't need it anyway. But the hassle of sending it back, the hassle of dealing with all of that, and now you don't have your Christmas presents on time, just a pain, and all that. And so as we look at Acts chapter 27 today, Paul is going to be a little bit damaged in shipping. And I think that he probably was hoping that, you remember in Acts chapter 18 in Ephesus, Paul was excited to go to Jerusalem because he was going to go to Jerusalem, and then after he was going to go to Jerusalem, he said, I want to see Rome. I must see Rome. And so that was his trajectory. That was his itinerary. Jerusalem, then Rome. But things didn't go exactly as he planned. And remember there in Jerusalem, as he got arrested and put in, as in custody, and as he's in there in the praetor, in the Antonia fortress, kind of waiting for something to happen, Jesus stands by him, and that was encouraging. Jesus stands by him, and he says, Paul, hey, you've testified me in Jerusalem, and now you're going to testify of me in Rome. So Paul's thinking, great, I'm going to get out tomorrow, book my passage to Rome, get there, and it will be great. But that didn't happen. Remember, there was a plot against his life. The commander sent him up to Caesarea, and so he stayed in Caesarea under Felix because Felix just couldn't make up his mind or had agendas. Stayed there for 2 years, just kind of languishing and waiting for something to happen. And then finally Festus comes in, and Festus, seeing Paul, bringing the Jews up, trying to work it out, nothing's happening, and Paul finally, fed up with the whole situation, just says, I appeal to Caesar, which was every Roman citizen's right. I appeal to Caesar. And he says, you've appealed to Caesar you must go. And the next day, as he stood before Agrippa and Bernice, he kind of laid this case out before them, shared the gospel with them, and Agrippa, in his words, he's like, he might have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. So it's kind of frustrating. So now Paul is going to be heading to Rome, and I think that Paul probably anticipated he's going to get to Rome untousled, unshaken, undrenched. He's going to get there, easily, and that's not going to be the case. He's going to go through severe trials to get him to Rome. And that's where we pick it up in Acts chapter 27 and verse 1. Excuse me. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering the ship of Andromedon, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So let's take a look at who we have on this ship, just individuals that we have on the ship. First of all, we have Paul the Apostle. And Paul the Apostle, of course, is a prisoner. He's the apostle of the Lord. God has his hand on him. He's sending him to Rome. Paul knows that God is supposed to send him to Rome, and so he's anticipating that. And as he is on this journey, we're going to notice that Paul goes from a prisoner to somebody who actually is kind of calling the shots for everything that's happening on this journey. Second of all, we have this leader, a centurion, a leader of 100 people, or 100 soldiers is what a centurion was, of the Augustan regiment. We don't know a lot about the Augustan regiment, but basically they had just different. Remember, Cornelius was of the Italian band, or the Italian regiment, and this guy is of the Augustan regiment, probably sanctioned by Caesar Augustus. But he is going to be taking prisoners to Rome. Some of them probably to fight in the arena with beasts and gladiators. Those who had death sentences would die that way. Of course, Rome was very interested in keeping everybody entertained, and that was probably the largest form of entertainment. On a side note, when we were in the Colosseum, they realized everybody in Rome, they kind of had a social program going where everybody got free food and everybody got free entertainment. And when they built the Colosseum, they actually gave every citizen in the entire city of Rome a ticket to go to the Colosseum. And so even though it couldn't fit every resident, on any given day you could go, and if there was room, they'd let you in. And if you were a slave, you had seats up in the top, and if you were rich, you had seats in the bottom. And the seats in the bottom, of course, were with the dignitaries and the rich people and officials and things like that. And it's amazing how they engineered it. In the top, as you go around the top of the Colosseum, the corridors are really narrow and small, the stairways are small, and at the bottom they're big. And that way they can get all the wealthy people can get out first and not have to mix with all the poor people. They're just engineered so there's not going to be a big bottleneck or anything like that. Very smart the way they did it. But the idea is they want everybody to be entertained. They want everybody to be entertained. And that was kind of the culture they lived in. Free food, free entertainment. Keep the citizens happy so they'll continue to serve the Roman Empire. Well, Julius is kind of the guy it's important for him to get the prisoners there so that they can have this entertainment. And so he's in charge of all these guys, and his life is on the line. If he doesn't deliver these prisoners, then he could suffer whatever fate they were going to suffer. And so he is a big task at hand. And I'd be surprised, after everything that's going to happen, if we don't see Julius in heaven, because I think he probably gets saved through this whole event. Then we have this guy, Aristarchus of Macedonia. He was with Paul coming to Jerusalem from Thessalonica. And, of course, Macedonia encompasses Thessalonica and Philippi, Thermopolis, all these, or whatever that town was. Actually, that's not right. Whatever the towns were. Maybe it's on the map. Do you have the map? You get the map up? Okay. It doesn't tell us. Okay. Anyway, you can leave that up. And so Aristarchus is from Macedonia. And remember that Paul was bringing people to Jerusalem with him to offer gifts to the Christians who were suffering in Jerusalem. And so Paul was bringing this gift, and Aristarchus was a representative from his town or maybe his region to bring that gift. Now, what's interesting about Aristarchus is that he's traveling with Paul. And we don't know in what capacity he's traveling with him. He could be just an attendant to Paul, or maybe he got arrested when Paul got arrested. Now, why would I say that? Well, because in Colossians, when Paul writes from Rome later, he's going to say this, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. And so Aristarchus, from some time between Paul's arrest, which, Paul, of course, was arrested in the court of the Gentiles, and it's very likely that Aristarchus was there with him in the court of the Gentiles and ran to save him maybe and was arrested along with Paul. We don't know. But whatever the case, at some point Aristarchus becomes a prisoner along with Paul. The last individual on this ship, not mentioned here, except for the pronoun we, is of course Dr. Luke. Now Luke was the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And he is with Paul at this time. And we know that Luke was a physician. Now, in their culture, a little bit different than our culture. In our culture, physicians make a lot of money, go to school for a long time and then make a lot of money. In their culture, oftentimes you would have a slave who was brought up as an apprentice to another physician, and he would basically be a personal physician for your home. And so they weren't the ones driving the Lexus chariot, with the big house on the hill, right? They were just a slave oftentimes. And so it's thought that Luke and maybe even Aristarchus were traveling with Paul as his slaves, because you could have attendants travel with you, although they were all just prisoners of Jesus, they knew, or slaves of Jesus, they may have traveled in that capacity. But then, of course, there's a bunch of prisoners on this ship. And then finally soldiers and crew members who'd be traveling, not this ship, but the next ship. They'll kind of be traveling mostly with Paul. So it says, verse 3, the next day we landed at Sidon. Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So if you can see on the map here, we start here in Caesarea, and he travels north to Sidon. Now their destination is all the way over here in the kneecap of Italy, right, in Rome. And so they're kind of heading this way. And then they're going to come up around this way to Myra. Just so you're following the map there, get your bearings on that. And so it says here that Paul is given freedom or liberty by Julius, this centurion. And that's an odd thing. Now, no doubt a soldier probably went with him. But why is Julius giving Paul special treatment? Some people would say, well, probably because Julius and Paul knew each other in Caesarea for so long. But chapter 27, verse 1 almost indicates that he's new to the story, like that he's never been known before, the way that Luke writes about him. And so why would he give him this special freedom? One of the speculations is that Festus, who is new to this case and knows that he doesn't have any formal charges against Paul, tells Julius to give him liberty because he doesn't want him to get to Rome and say, I was poorly treated by Festus. Because, if he's just going to be let go, Festus doesn't want to cause any trouble. And Festus was a fair individual. So likely that Festus gave him some freedom. Paul's able to just get help from his friends and reconnect with other believers. Remember, last time 2 years ago, when Paul came to this region, he landed at Tyre. And Tyre and Sidon are kind of, right next to each other. And so he knew Christians in that area, and he was able probably to go. And we don't know how long they were there. It would indicate that they were there for some time. And, we have layovers of a couple hours, maybe a day at the most, but they had layovers of weeks sometimes. And so, waiting for items to come or things the ship to fill up so that they could go and make it profitable. So it's hard to say. But Paul spends some time there with his friends in Tyre and Sidon area. And then, verse 4, and when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And so, again, they're going from Sidon, and rather than just make a quicker trip to go directly to Myra, they go up north around Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, and which is quite a ways. And then they pass these cities here. And remember, these cities here, Pamphylia and, where is it? Cilicia and Pamphylia, this area right here, Cilicia is where remember, that's where Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey. So Christianity has already spread to these areas here of Galatia and Pamphylia. And so as Paul stops at Myra, no doubt everywhere he goes, he's thinking to himself, what brothers and sisters in Christ am I going to be able to connect with? And that's kind of the way that it was for him, because everywhere Paul went, whether it was in Pamphylia or Galatia, Cilicia, Syria, Macedonia, Greece, Achaia, all these places Paul had planted churches. And all these places had believers that would be excited to bless Paul, to provide for him, to take him in. And that was a beautiful thing. I just think about Paul going from place to place, and he wasn't alone. And that's true for us as Christians too. We're not alone. Once we love Jesus, and once he becomes an important part of our life, it's amazing how you can just go anywhere in the world and find other believers, and instantly you have everything in common with each other. You have a connection with people that you just met, and you have everything in common because they love Jesus like you love Jesus. And that's an awesome thing. In fact, Jesus would say that himself. He would say in Mark chapter, I have a medicine head, so if I say weird stuff, I'm sorry. Not medicine head, but cold head. Mark chapter 10, verse 29, Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, there is no one who has left houses and brothers and sisters or father or mother, wife or children or lands for my sake and the gospel's, who shall not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, there's the caveat, with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. And so, many people, when they come to Christ, that's what happens to us. Maybe you were sitting in the basement smoking pot and your life was going nowhere, but then one day you found Jesus, and now all of a sudden you're excited about the Lord, and you love Jesus and you want to serve him, and your family liked you better when you were down in the basement smoking pot going nowhere. It's amazing. Your friends don't like the new Jesus guy who doesn't sit in the basement and smoke pot all the time. They like this, they liked him, but they hate this guy who actually wants to live a good life and serve Jesus. And it's almost like, why don't you go back down in the basement again, We liked you before better. And so we lose family, don't we? And my wife and I can attest to that. We've lost friends, we've lost family. People have hated us because we became Christians. And yet, even though people hate you when you become a Christian, you gain so much more. And I just remember feeling, even when my family was kind of against me, and I remember feeling how close I felt to my Christian friends. Of course, my family was Christian, and they just thought Calvary Chapel was a cult, so they kind of gave me some trouble with that. I remember my dad telling me one time, those people are Pentecostals, don't you? I didn't even know what that meant at the time. I was just excited to be saved, But the reality is that sometimes people don't understand, and sometimes you lose folks, but the reality is when you have a church family, you have family. You have true family. Just Jesse and Kathy coming here last week, it was kind of cool just for them to reconnect to us. And Jesse kept saying that, you guys are my family. I feel so connected with you guys. You're my family, and I love you guys. And yet what was weird is I had to get up and introduce him because half of you didn't even know who Jesse was. Because in the last 14 months, our church has grown, and so there's new people and new faces. And so the cool thing about that is now we had new people who are instantly family, who could hear his heart, and now are praying for him. And that's the beautiful thing about this. And so Paul, going from place to place, he's meeting up with people, he's reconnecting with people. But it says, verse 4, when we have put out... No, that's not the verse we're on. Verse 6, it says, Then the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. And so it's Julius's job to keep track of all these prisoners and to book their fares and to get them to Rome. And he's kind of adjusting and shifting their itinerary and finding this Alexandrian ship, of course, from Alexandria, Egypt. And this is a grain ship, we're going to find out later. A very large ship. We're going to find out also that the passengers on this ship were 276. And so looking at history and the ships that would be available from Alexandria, we pretty much can identify what ship this was. And this is a ship that was 200 feet long and had a displacement of 1,200 tons. And so it could carry a lot of goods and a lot of people. And it was basically to take grain from Egypt, which is a normal thing, up to Europe or up to Italy specifically, so you can make some pasta, right? Because they use a lot of grain there, making pasta al dente, right? And if you don't know what that is, then you should try it because it's wonderful. But making pasta, making pizza, and so that's what this ship's job is, to take that. And so they're going to take passengers as well. And this is a big, heavy ship, very strong, not super fast, but a sturdy vessel. Verse 7, when they had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty in Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete to Salmone. So things are moving very slowly as they struggle against the weather. And so they're here at Myra, and they're kind of coming down this way, staying between Crete and this area of Asia here, and they end up here up in Cnidus. And just not going anywhere very fast. It says, verse 8, passing with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Men, I perceive that this voyage will end in disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives. Now, we get a clue a little bit about what time of year it is and when this happened. It would have been the feast that he's talking about, or the fast that they were taking, would have been the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so this would have been September of 57 AD that this took place. In September of 57 AD. And they're heading into October. Now, the problem with heading into October is that September and October, it was getting dangerous to sail. And it was really a crapshoot when it came to the safety of sailing in October or September, October in that part of the world, the Mediterranean. It was basically a gamble. It could be good weather, it might be bad weather. Kind of like living in Idaho. You never know. One day it's going to, like right now, it's out there, it's sunny, in about 20 minutes it'll be 40 below and snowing. We just don't know what we're going to get, right? It just changes all the time. Last year we had summer in the middle of winter, everything bloomed and then died. It's just, we just don't know. It's just one of those weird places. But this place, it was pretty predictable. April through August, clean sailing, no problems. September, October, getting dangerous. And then November through March, you didn't sail at all, because that was winter. Every ship would port, dock, and then stay there for the winter. And it's at this time that the Holy Spirit begins to talk to Paul about things that are going to go down. And Paul would not have a lot of credibility with the people on the ship. He was basically giving them information that, things might not go so well. But they're not really ready at this point to listen to him. And that happens. And yet, just because God told you something and nobody believes it or wants to listen to you, does not mean that God does not have a purpose for it. Just to give you an example, years ago, 10 years ago, because Isaiah's 10 now, years ago, Shannon and I were really praying for about a decade. For about almost 10 years, we were praying about being able to have children. We couldn't have children, and we really wanted to have children, and so we were praying about that. And specifically, we prayed independently of each other that at this specific retreat we were going to, that God would speak to us about that. And he did. A prophetic word was given that we were going to have children. Now, because we had specifically prayed about it, and it was so obvious, we just believed it. There was just no question in our mind. And we told, because we believed it, and it wasn't like we ate too much Hawaiian pizza, and thought God wanted us to go to Hawaii or something like that. We really knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that God was going to do this. And so we felt very comfortable telling all of our Christian friends, as well as all of my wife's non-believing family, that we were going to have a child because the Lord told us we were going to. And we told them the story. And for the most part, Christians or non-Christians, pretty much everybody just felt sorry for us, right? It's poor folks, and they didn't believe. And that's okay, I get that. Of course, you don't just believe something at somebody's word, especially something like that. But, we waited an entire year. An entire year went by. And then as the year was ending, Shannon went to a women's retreat where a woman spoke a specific word of prophecy over her that she was going to have a child very soon. And we were still so convinced, even though it had been a year, and we were wondering what's soon to God, right? But we were so convinced that once again, we told all of our friends and all of our family, believing and non-believing. And then a month later, on that day, we conceived. And then 9 months later, we had Isaiah, our son who's now 10 years old. And so, what did that do? Well, for believers who didn't believe us necessarily, they felt bad for us because, and they gave us all kinds of suggestions. Maybe you'll adopt, or maybe you're supposed to do in vitro or something like that, but we knew better. But for them, it was like, man, God is awesome. God is real, right? It really encouraged their faith. But for non-believers, it kind of troubled them a little bit. Oh man, God is real. Uh-oh, God is real. More like, it's like putting the grain of sand in their shell and, letting it wobble around in there and be uncomfortable until they finally produce that pearl, get saved. And so that's kind of what God is doing with Paul here. He's giving him a word of knowledge. Paul's saying, hey, we're going to lose everything if we go on this trip. And yet nobody's going to take heed to that because they don't have any reason to. Notice what it says in verse 11. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And maybe Paul was frustrated by this, but what do you expect? Paul, he's not a sailor. He's not, he doesn't own the ship. He's, not taking a vessel. These guys live in this thing. The helmsman, the owner of the ship, this is their business. They know better. And they're like, hey, we know. And yet God will use this word of knowledge in a better way. Verse 12, it says, and because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, translation, the harbor was fine to settle in, or winter in, but the problem is there probably just wasn't enough there to keep the sailors entertained. And that's really what's going on here. Because, commentaries say, no, people winter here all the time. It's just a small town and not a lot to offer. And so it's not suitable. They didn't want to. It says the majority advised to set sail from there also. So more than wanted to stay, wanted to go. If by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. And so Phoenix they're here in Fair Havens. Phoenix is here on the end. Phoenix was a happening place, you know. You wanted to go to a brothel or a bar or something like that. It was all available there. And so that's kind of what is going on here. They didn't want to get stuck in Fair Havens, you know, for the winter. They wanted to go somewhere that was a little bit more suitable to their needs. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. And so they're kind of skirting along the bottom of Crete, that little island of Crete there. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. That sounds intimidating, doesn't it? So Paul has warned them, and they didn't listen to the things that he said, and now things are immediately starting to get ugly. Now, it's possible that Paul felt a little bit like, I've been here before, this doesn't feel right. I don't, you know, and no doubt the Holy Spirit is speaking to him, but Paul isn't speaking from a position of ignorance at all. In fact, Paul would say, and this surprised me, when I read 2 Corinthians and having read the book of Acts, when I was a brand new Christian, I remember reading 2 Corinthians assuming that what he was talking about in 2 Corinthians was what was happening in the book of Acts. The first time I studied through the book of Acts, I remember learning that actually 2 Corinthians was written probably 2.5 years to 3 years before Paul even went on this journey. And so with that in mind, listen to what he says, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 24. Paul just kind of going through some of the things that he'd been through as a Christian. He says, from the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned, not in the Timothy Leary sense, but the rock thrown at you sense. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Okay, think about that. He has been in 3 separate shipwrecks. That's crazy, right? 3 times shipwrecked. And then listen, this is creepy. A night and the day I have been in the deep. Could you imagine an entire night and an entire day just bobbing up and down, waiting for somebody to save you, not knowing if you're going to drown, looking for fins across the water, you know, dun-dun, 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 and then it's dark, and then you're like, what? Okay, this troubled Paul deeply. Now, let me, no pun intended. Verse 26, notice this, in journeys often, in perils of water. He brings it up again. In perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness. Again, in perils in the sea. This messed him up, didn't it? 3 times he mentions it. In perils among false brethren, in weariness and in toil, in sleeplessness often, probably in the sea, in hunger and thirst, probably in the sea, in fastings often, in coldness and nakedness, probably in the sea. You know, I mean, he's like, besides other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. So my speculation is Paul was probably a little bit sea shy, if not suffering from full-on thalassophobia, which is fear of the sea, which I can relate to a little bit, and maybe some PTSD. We can diagnose Paul. But I was talking to Jeremiah as we were looking at this passage, and he's like, oh, I love that chapter. You know, all the sea stuff and all the storm and, you know, all of that. And I'm just thinking, you know what? I have to confess, it gives me a little bit of anxiety. I don't like the ocean at all. And just to read about this just like raises my blood pressure just a little bit. Just to think about what they're about to go through. And I've read, you know, Shannon and I are avid readers. We love, you know, missionary biographies. And having read a lot of Christian and missionary biographies, do you realize that every time somebody goes across on a sea voyage, they almost die? It's like in every book. I mean, I was reading Don Passage. We were reading Don Passage the other day, and we were thinking, okay, it's a schooner that's going to go to the Greek Isles to share the gospel. What I didn't realize is the story is just about the people delivering the ship. They don't even actually get to the place where they're starting to share the gospel. That was somebody else's job. Their job is just to almost die getting there, right? And so you read this thing, and like people are almost dying from seasickness because of dehydration. Other people almost get thrown overboard. One guy climbs up the mast and gets his hand all messed up. And I mean, it's like, why would anybody ever do that, right? I mean, it's just crazy. And then, of course, reading Out of the Depths, which is a perfect perfect name for John Newton's biography. You know, basically he'd been in like horrible, you know, storms and stuff at sea, unbroken. Of course, we read that. You know, that's horrible. You know, they wreck the plane in the water, and he floats for however many 60 days on the water in that little rubber raft. No, thank you. And then to the Golden Shore, Adoniram Judson. How many trials, excuse me, they had going over the sea. You know, and in so many stories, you even think about the guy who wrote It Is Well. He wrote It Is Well while he was traveling over the place where the ship sunk, where he lost his daughters. Why would anybody ever get on a boat? That's what I want to know. I don't know. Okay, so maybe it's my own little phobia. But these guys start to head to the end of the island of Crete. They want to get to Phoenix, where, you know, it's happening. And then all of a sudden, this Euroclydon, and now somebody call, you know, some people call it Euroclydon. Other people it's more like a Greek demon name, like Euroclydon or something like that. I don't know. Whatever you want to call this thing, I'm just thinking, release the Kraken, right? You know, these people are like on the ship, and it's like, oh, a nice warm, you know, south wind blowing. It's gentle, and then all of a sudden, boom! And they're like holding on. They lower their sails, and this Euroclydon, this hurricane, pushes them 500 miles without sails. That's how intense this storm is. And it's hard to, you know, just kind of reading through the commentaries and stuff on this, I started to get really sick, you know, like seasick. Verse 15, and so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. You know, they're trying to get over to Crete, the end of Crete, and it's just like, we're just going to lose our entire mast. You know, we need to drop this off and just let the ship drive. And so the ship just begins to drive. And running under the shelter of the island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So, smaller ship that they would tow behind them, kind of a lifeboat, if you will, that these ships would tow behind them. They want to get the skiff out of the water, otherwise they're going to lose the skiff. And so they bring it up alongside. At the same time, they're throwing cables underneath the ship. Notice here in verse 17, and when we had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on citrus sands, they struck sail and so were driven. So they take their skiff on board, and then they begin to tie cables around their ship so that it doesn't break apart. Let me just say this. If you were on a boat and they start to tie the boat up so it doesn't break apart, you're in trouble. Now, what's happening here is this ship had a giant mast, and this giant mast stuck out right in the middle of the ship, like most masts do. Had, you know, it sails across, and so even though the sails are not open, it is going like this. The wind is just hitting that mast, and the entire ship is starting to shear. And it's just kind of racking the ship, and the boards are starting to come apart. And so they start to they put some duct tape around it, and they're just patching it with, you know, whatever they can to try to keep the thing from falling apart. Now, this is when you know you're in trouble. And so it says, verse 18, and because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. And so you want to get the weight out of the ship so that the shear is not as intense. So that it's not pulling as hard, it will go faster. And on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So Luke is saying they got everybody involved. You know, Luke's throwing it over, Paul's throwing stuff over, everybody's throwing stuff overboard. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Now, you have to understand what's happening here. They are going for many days. And when you are in this type of a sea, and I know just from reading, and I get sick reading these books, but I know from reading, when you are in this type of a sea and it's tempest-tossed and you're swaying and there's water coming up over the edge and spraying people and everybody's holding on for dear life, you don't sleep. Instead of sleep, what you do in lieu of sleep is vomit. Because everybody on that ship, I don't care how much you got your sea legs, when you are tempest-tossed for several days on end, you can't, your stomach cannot hold it, and everybody at that point becomes sick. And so, you know, unless they've been on the sea for years, pretty much everybody is vomiting. And everybody's sick, and nobody's eating because of this. And so basically they're exhausted, Their bodies are racked from throwing up. They're discouraged. And if that wasn't enough, they've had cloud cover for several days. So they're being driven by the wind, and they can't even pull out their sextant to look at the stars and find out where in the world they are. They've been pushed for several days north, northwest, actually far northwest, and they don't even know. They don't know if they're in the open sea. They don't know if they're going to run into a beach somewhere. They don't know. They're just kind of in the dark and sick and tired, and they just give up hope. It says, verse 21, but after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. So finally Paul stands up and he says, this is my moment. I told you so, you know. And this is when they grab him and they throw him overboard, if he wouldn't have said what he says next. Verse 22, and now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as he has told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. So these guys are discouraged, they're sick, they're tired, they're hungry, despairing of life. And then Paul stands up and says, hey, remember I told you about this, guys? But God has told me by his angel that no one's going to lose their life. And so God gives a word of life to these guys at just the right time. And at this point, Julius is realizing there's something different about this guy. And God has a purpose. And that's another thing he says. God is taking us to a specific island. Not just some island, not just some port, not just some place. But there's a specific island that we must go to. Now think of this in terms of this Euroclydon, and in terms of this storm. And Paul has been in a storm for a lot longer than just the Euroclydon, right? Paul has been in a storm in his life ever since he got arrested in Jerusalem and they almost beat him to death, and then he got, put in prison, and he's been there for 2 years uncharged. He's like, when is this going to end? Then he gets on the ship, and then now they're going through these trials at sea, and he's thinking to himself, what is the meaning of all of this? And then God gives him a message and says, hey, I have a reason. There's a specific place you're supposed to be and a specific time that he's supposed to be there. Now, I just think of this, and it seems like right now in the world and in our nation, we're kind of facing a storm of sorts, right? Our own little Euroclydon, or Euroclydon, or however you want to say it. That there's a lot going on. I mean, we think of ISIS, we think of shootings, we think of, just the direction of our government and the direction it's going, and a lot of that can lead to discouragement, can it? And yet, don't we know, Christian, that God is in control? Doesn't God have a plan for all of this? I mean, isn't it? You remember the end of the book? I don't know if you've read the end of the book, but it says right here, we win at the end. And so I think it's, of all people groups, of all people in the world, I think that it's the Christian who should be the optimistic one. We should be the ones anticipating great things from God. Because I can tell you, I know that I've gone through things in my life where I just, thought, oh, this is just a trial, or this is just an awful circumstance, and I just kind of went through it all humdrum and upset, and it just kind of was an awful circumstance. But there's other times when I said, you know what, God, I think God has a reason for this. And I think God will do something through this. And you know what, it seems like, just mysteriously, when I believe that God is going to do something and turn things out to good, that I get to see it as he does. Let it be according to your faith, right? Because I think that as Christians, we can go through life as pessimists, we can arm ourselves, and we can be angry, and we can be ready to fight. Or we can say, you know what, I believe God's bigger than all of this, and I think that God's going to pull us through, and I think that God could use me. With persecutions, maybe. But that's part of it. And I think that God is going to use my life for something greater. And I think that should be our perspective. We should be the most optimistic people in the world. And so Paul gives them this optimism. Verse 27, it says, now when the 14th night had come, oh my goodness, 14 nights, no direction, 500 miles they've been driven by this wind. The 14th night had come, we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea. So they've traveled from Crete, this is where they are, all the way over here. Slightly, mostly west, slightly north, but mostly west. They don't know if they're going that way or they're going out here. They have no idea where they are. And so it's 14 days they've been driven in the Adriatic Sea. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day, oh wait, no, that's the wrong one. Where am I at? Oh yeah, over right here. Okay, Adriatic Sea, verse 27. About midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near to some land. And so these guys have been on the sea long enough, and they have felt the waves enough to know what it feels like. And if you're good at anything, like an expert at anything, you kind of understand this. They could feel, the water's shallower here. It's just the way the waves are breaking on the boat. They feel it. It's just the same way a tennis person can sense where the ball's going to be. Just the same way a skateboarder can, jump and do a flip and know where the board's going to land. It all just becomes part of you, right? And so they've been in the sea long enough they can feel everything. And so it says, verse 28, they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. So it's getting shallower as they go. Then, fearing lest they should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors on the stern and prayed for day to come. So this is significant. They dropped these 4 anchors, and they hit the bottom there, trying to keep themselves from getting any shallower because it's nighttime. They don't want to run into something, and they can't see anything because it's dark. And then they pray. Isn't it interesting? I mean, think about it. Sailors, soldiers, prisoners, prayer warriors. Yeah, everybody's a prayer warrior when they, go through something hard. There's no atheists in the foxholes, right? It's amazing how religious people become when things get intense. Verse 30, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, notice this, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. So all the professionals, all the sailors, everybody who's running the ship, they sneak over to the side. Hey, we're going to put out anchors, and they're starting to lower down the skiff. They're trying to escape the ship and just let everybody, all the soldiers and the prisoners, just perish. That's their plan. And so Paul, whether by the Spirit or whether he saw them doing it, he's like, hey, all your sailors are escaping. If they get off the ship, we're all going to die. And so this says, verse 32, then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and they let it fall off. So plot foiled. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them to all take food, saying, today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head, the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged, and also took food for themselves. And so amazing how one person filled with faith can be such an example, such an encouragement to all these other people. One guy out of 270 or 267 or 276 people, and he encourages all of them. And I love this because not only is he calling all the shots now, everybody's kind of looking to Paul, and he's telling them what to do, and they're listening. But he says, okay, guys, we're just going to all eat now because you all need to eat. If you don't eat, you're going to starve to death. But God promised that you're not going to die if you eat. So everybody eat. But, don't eat yet. We're going to pray, right? And he prays for the food. And I think it's important that we pray for food. We thank God. It's just a time to stop in your day and to thank God for what he's given you. And we, of all people, have more to be thankful for than most people in the world. We're so grateful for what God has done for us and the food that we have to eat. We need to stop and say thank you. And I don't care if you're in the restaurant, and everybody's around, and you just, just say, you know what, hey guys, hey family, we're just going to stop and we're going to pray. We're going to pray over this food and just thank God for it. I think it's an example to the people around us. There was a a man who was a guest speaker at a Bible college. He took a bunch of Bible college students out to lunch afterwards, and they're all sitting there, and the Bible college students just start digging in. And he's like, aren't you guys going to pray? And one of them says, oh, we don't want to offend anybody. And so he immediately just stands up and he says, excuse me, everybody, can I have your attention, please? These are Bible college students here, and they wanted to pray for their food, and so I want everybody just to bow their heads. We're all going to pray. And so everybody bows their heads, and he's like, thank you, God, for this food. We just appreciate all you've given. And he just goes through this long prayer, and then he says, amen. And then everybody applauded in the restaurant. They're afraid. Oh, no, we don't, but Paul he doesn't care. Soldiers, prisoners, sailors, he prays, and they pray with him. And it says, and in all we were 276, that's the number, 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. No pasta. This is too bad. And threw the wheat out into the sea. Now the idea here is you want less weight in the ship so that you can have more buoyancy. Because the higher the ship rides in the sea, the higher the draft, the easier it is to get over sandbars and dangerous things. And that's the idea here. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach. So they don't know where they are. They have no idea in the world where they are, but they see this bay with a beach, which they plan to run the ship if possible. So hopefully we can just get into that bay and just park the ship in the bay and anchor down. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. So they cut these anchors off, leave them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they had hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. So they basically let the rudder go free. They hoist the sails up, but striking a place where two seas meet, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And so what had happened is a reef had been created where two sides of the sea kind of were crashing in the middle rather than up against the bay. They were crashing in the middle, which caused a reef to form there. And so as they were driving forward, the ship just struck this shallow spot, and as the front of the ship, the stern is being broken up in the back. The front of the ship stuck, and the stern is being broken up by the violence of the waves. Now, thinking about all this, interestingly enough, a few years back, a guy by the name of Bob Cornuke was visiting the island of Malta, which is the island that they're on. And as he's visiting this island in Malta, he goes to St. Peter's Island, which is supposedly, or St. Paul's Island, supposedly where Paul had shipwrecked. But he's looking at everything and he's saying this does not match the biblical description at all. And so he gets with some fishermen and he says, hey, do you know where there's a place where the sea comes together into one place, from opposite directions and the waves crash, where there's a reef or a sandbar and a beach with a bay. Or a bay with a beach, rather. A bay with a beach. And so there's a couple possibilities. And so they looked at a couple different possibilities. And then he consulted with a guy who was an expert on Mediterranean storms. And he was familiar with this Euroclydon storm that would come through every few years and blow wind, kind of westward and northward. And so he consulted with that guy and he said, well, if you came in, if it was that wind coming from Crete, this is probably where you'd land about here. Driving 500 miles, you'd land about here. And so they came to the conclusion that it must have been St. Thomas's Bay there in Malta. And of course, as they kind of examined the bay, they found that there was it's called a Mouchar Reef, was the name of the reef that's right there, where two seas meet, a beach with a bay, and he said, I wonder if there are anchors there. Well, as he inquired with some people, there was some divers who told him, four anchors were found on the edge of the Mouchar Reef in the 70s, and they're in the Malta Maritime Museum. And so they went and looked at these anchors and had them looked at by an expert, and they were first century anchors, boat anchors. And so they speculate that these were the anchors of Paul. And so you can actually go on Google, type in Paul's anchors and watch a CBN special on the four anchors of Paul. It's pretty interesting. And yet, it's amazing. All this stuff comes together, and we read this stuff, and everything that matches here. And what's amazing about all of these things that are mentioned here, it's pretty obvious by everything that's mentioned by Luke that it was an eyewitness account. And you can trace the steps and see, we just trust the Bible. We always find it to be reliable. Anyway, moving on, verse 42. And the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. So the ship's breaking up. Might as well kill these prisoners. If they don't die, then we might die, right? And if they escape, then we might be killed in the arena in their place. And so, it says, verse 43, but the centurion, wanting to save Paul, he recognizes something about him, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest, some on boards and some, that's the first surfers there, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped to land safely. Think about this. 276 people thrown overboard. What are the chances of everybody surviving? Not real great, especially in a storm. And every single person survives. It's miraculous. It's God. And God has a specific reason for them to be on that island, because we're going to find out in the next chapter that a revival is going to break out on Malta because of Paul being there. That's the beautiful thing. God allows storms. God allows persecutions. And I don't know what storm you're going on through in your life right now. Maybe marriage difficulties. Maybe it's that diagnosis that you got. Maybe unexplained things. 1 year you blow your knee out. The next year you break your hand. You get stung by bees. That's what's happened to me. I mean, it's like, I got... Okay, in almost 42 years now, as a kid, I got stung by a bee once. In the last 2 years, I got stung twice. Once in my hand, the day before I'm going to get wood for the winter. The only day I have available to get wood, I get stung on the hand. Then, this last year, I'm staying out of it because I broke my hand, right? So I'm staying out of it. They're out here putting metal on the building. I go out there just to see what's going on, and a bee comes up and stings me on the bicep. Now, the benefit of that was I had a huge bicep. I mean, it was cool. I took pictures of it and everything. Like, this is awesome. Just see this. I'm like Popeye. But now when I go through these trials, breaking my hand, breaking my hand, getting stung, I just figure, God has a reason for this. And I think that when we have that mindset that God has a reason for this, nothing is happening in my life because I'm a child of God. Nothing is going to happen in my life by accident. He has a reason for everything. Maybe to slow me down. But maybe I'm going to be at the doctor's office and I'm going to be able to talk to somebody about Jesus or just whatever. I don't know what God's purposes are for everything, but I do know this, that God has a purpose for everything. And the difficulties we go through now are maybe strengthening us for something later, or maybe the difficulties we're going through now may be just God moving us in the right direction, that Euroclide, and pushing us to a place we never would have gone, and yet God is going to take us and use us there. And yet, as I said before, I believe that oftentimes when bad things happen to us, and I just think it's a bad thing and I don't give any thought to God, then it just ends up being a bad thing, and I'm kind of kept from what God was doing. But if I have that anticipation and say, you know what, God, I know you have a reason for this. I know there's a purpose behind this storm that I'm going through, that we end up beginning, as we go through that storm, we begin to see God's hand in all of it. And He stands by us and He tells us, hey, this is what's going on. And He encourages and He strengthens us. And the next thing you know, we see at the other end how God used it for His purpose. And so as Christians, no matter what storm we're going through, we should be the most optimistic people in the world. We do believe still, right? I mean, Romans 8:20, I just checked a minute ago, it's still in my Bible. All things work together for good to those who love God and those who are the called according to His purpose. And we can take that to the bank. And I believe that when we go through these things and we're looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, when we're looking to Him, He begins to make it apparent as to why these things are happening oftentimes. And maybe if He doesn't show us why, He begins to show us the good things that are going to come out of it. But even if it's, a long period of time, 14 days, and nothing's happening, or 14 years and nothing's happening, we need to hold the faith to know that God has everything under control. And He will ultimately bring about his purpose. And when we look back in it, whether it's in heaven or a few years later, we'll see, God, I see what God was doing there. I see that he had a good purpose in mind for it. Let's pray.